Well, hello there and welcome to Warbird Wednesday. My name is Fred Bell. I am the Vice Chairman of the Palm Springs Air Museum. And today we're in the Pacific Hangar going down the road of very rare Japanese attack aircraft. We're going to be talking about the Nakajima, the B5N, the Kate. But before I do that, Greg has found a way to get me back in dreadlocks, which I am amazed he managed to do that. So I am in dreadlocks today. I have to tell you, normally there's some theming with everything today. I think Greg has basically thrown caution to the wind. My invidious assistant has decided to go ahead and quaff me in some really unusual stuff. And again, Greg, I think probably the hat haters will be out in force on this one. I'm going to toss that off camera. There we go. So we're talking about the Kate, and we also were on a budget today. We have, I would call this airplane the mini-me of the models that we have done. This is the Kate. We'll go ahead and give you a plan view of the airplane. Now, the Kate first flew in 1937 under the Type K designation. It had a top speed of 235 miles an hour. It was introduced shortly thereafter. There were various versions of the aircraft with different power plants. The best version was the B5N-2. So the interesting thing about the Kate was now we're getting into weapons systems. And what do I mean by that? Well, you can have a fighter that goes up and does what it does in World War II. And we talked about the Aichi, the Val, last week. You can have the Val, but the reality of it is maybe you have the shape of the bomb or the fuse. But when you start getting into torpedo bombers, we're going to talk about that today, and I'm taking off, I don't know if you can see that, this Type 91 torpedo. Now you're talking about a weapon system because you have a man and a targeting system in the aircraft. This little torpedo is moving when it's dropped, and he has to calculate that. The pilot has to calculate, or the bombardier, whoever's releasing the torpedo, has to calculate where that ship is going to be and where the torpedo is going to be in order to hit it. Remember, they're down very low. They're making an attack run on a ship, and basically the ship has to move to an intersecting point where they've dropped this torpedo in order for the torpedo to be effective. In other words, it strikes the ship, detonates. The rest, as you know, is history. The ship sinks. But back in the mid-1930s to, prior to World War II, this was very, very raw technology. In other words, it was being tested. This aircraft at the time was one of the best of the torpedo bomber type that had been introduced. The comparable aircraft would be the TBD Devastator, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, the Farley Albacore, and the Farley Barracuda. So Greg's got a few aircraft to look up. Now this Type 91 torpedo, although it looks like a little cocktail frank here, that it's actually a torpedo design, Greg can throw one up, was designed by a design team by Seiji Naruse. I hope I didn't, where he was a rear admiral in the armaments division of the Japanese Imperial Navy. He is the one that caused the design of this torpedo. Now, the Type 91 torpedo was, like a lot of other Japanese weapons that were developed pre-war, it was really good. And it was probably the most effective aerial torpedo used in the world at that time. Now, it had a couple of things about it, and you're saying, Greg is looking at me going, why was it so effective, Fred? Well, I'm going to tell you. There were two things. One, the torpedoes, when they went in the water, had a tendency to roll. They would corkscrew. This had an anti-roll system that was built into it. The other thing was, on the back of the torpedo, there were fins, little wooden fins that would break away. In some cases at low altitude, they put a nose cone on the torpedo as well. But these little fins would break away, and when the torpedo dropped into the water, it could run at very shallow depths. Now, why is that important? It is important because later the Japanese would attack Pearl Harbor, and this weapon against, now in Pearl Harbor, those ships were moored, right? They were probably the easiest targets in the world, but the Japanese had incredible success with torpedo bombers, high-level bombers, and dive bombers at Pearl Harbor. But this torpedo was extremely effective because guess what? If you punch holes in the hulls of those battleships, you put them out a lot longer than if you have vertical bomb damage. Now, the exception would be if Greg can find the stabilized video of the Arizona taking an armored bomb, I believe, from a Kate into its front magazine, which is really what destroyed the Arizona, went off with the force of a small atomic weapon. It was a tremendous explosion, destroyed the ship. But so when we're talking about the Kate, we have to be thinking about a weapon system. Now let's go back to the American Devastator. The Devastator in the mid-1930s, when it was introduced, was the most sophisticated aircraft of its type that had ever been developed. To give you an idea how fast technology was changing at that time, by the time it entered the war, the United States entered the war, it was a death trap. It was completely obsolete. The B5N was nearing obsolescence, but because they had trained combat air crews, because they had been fighting ahead of the actual start of World War II, the aircraft was very effective. Now you're saying, Greg, how effective was it? Well, it was very effective. It sunk the Lexington at the Battle of Coral Sea. It sunk the Hornet at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, and it damaged, although the Japanese suffered horrible losses at the Battle of Midway, and we're not going to spend any time on that. It damaged the Yorktown at the Battle of Midway. At the end of its life, though, it was totally obsolete, and like all other Japanese types, it was used in kamikaze attacks. Now, the number built, and we touched on that with the VAL a little bit. We're going to touch on it again, and this is the roadmap as to why the Japanese lost the war. They only made 1,149 of these aircraft. So think about that for a second. Basically, they outfitted their attack carriers or their carrier battle groups with the aircraft, but there were no reserves. There were no reserves whatsoever. So like we talked about with the VAL, when they started suffering combat losses and they lost the trained air crews that they had at the start of the war, which were so effective. Remember, right here, we're talking about 3 American fleet carriers that this aircraft was involved in the destruction of. Once they lost those experienced air crews, the rest of it was just game over. They were never going to be able to recover. Now, the Japanese went on to develop the B5N. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that. It had a lot of teething trouble, and it came in late in the war, and it had no impact on the war whatsoever, because at that time, the Japanese had lost the initiative. They were completely on the defensive. And as I said, this airplane, if you got into, and I'm standing in front of the nemesis of a number of Japanese aircraft, like we talked about Grumman, where now we're talking about the Corsair. This aircraft behind me was the nemesis of many, many Japanese attack aircraft and fighters in the midpoint to the end of the war. Now, the interesting thing about this is there are no complete surviving examples of this aircraft anywhere in the world. There are bits and bobs, and Greg can find some of the bits and bobs, but there are chunks of airplanes. There's a couple of incomplete aircraft out there, but there are no complete surviving examples. So this is another Axis aircraft that literally is just gone from the face of the earth. And there was no effort at the end of the war to save any of these. They were I would imagine that most of them were pretty much gone. Maybe there are a few examples left, but I think they were gone. Now I'm going to go ahead and put this down, and I'm going to go ahead to my stage 2 today. I want to talk about, I talked about attack crews the last time, but specifically today, I would be remiss if I did not talk about the Devastator crews and at the Battle of Midway. The Devastator crews at the Battle of Midway, the American attack was a hodgepodge attack, and the Americans had been attacking the Japanese with everything from the new TBM that we had. There had been high-level bombers. There had been ground-based aircraft from Midway Island. They got lucky in that they managed to trail a Japanese destroyer, the Dauntlesses, back to the main fleet. And I'm going through the history of Midway, but it would not have been possible for the Battle of Midway to be successful because the Devastators pulled the Japanese Combat Air Patrol down, and basically they were, devastated is not a right word because it's a play on the airplane, but they were nearly killed to a man. The units were completely destroyed, and it is unusual in American aircraft and squadron histories that you have the type of loss. But when I talk about that they were lost to a man, quite literally, and maybe Greg can throw up combat losses from Midway, but literally none of them came back. Now, there was a problem, and we'll talk about that after we get through the stage 2 with the American Torpedo, which I want to close up with. But those crews, if they had not done that, the Japanese aircraft, the Combat Air Patrol, might have been at the same height of those dive bombers, and the whole situation could have turned out much differently. If the Japanese, any of those Japanese carriers had survived in any great strength, the war, as I believe, the war was inevitable that the Japanese would have lost, but it could have gone on for years longer. So to those Devastator crews, those heroes, I mean true heroes, and their families, the people that, the Gold Star families that lost those air crews at the Battle of Midway, I salute you. Now, let's see. You know, I'm moving through the drink. This is, again, Greg has gone totally random today. This is ski soda. It's made out of pure cane sugar, 170 calories, so not too bad. I don't even know where it's bottled. They're not excited about where it's bottled, but I'm going to ski into this, Greg. I'll tell you, that soda you gave me last week when I popped it, the smell was so repugnant that it hit me the minute I opened it. This is not bad. This is kind of like a, I'm going to date myself here, but if you had a Fresca, you know, that like lemon lime soda type thing, that's kind of what it is. Not bad, Greg. This one, I could actually finish this. I'll have another swig. Why not? Just wet my whistle. But Greg has failed in his attempt today to give me some form of food poisoning. Now, if you want to, and we're standing in front of really one of the heroes of World War II, adorn your home office with something that is absolutely incredible, you can click on the link with Jason, and this is made out of real metal, Greg. This is heavy. This is industrial. You can click on this link and get this really cool Corsair sign. Now, the interesting thing for those purists, that's a birdcage canopy Corsair. So that's actually a very early model Corsair. So I'll throw that out there. If you're thinking about buying this, this is the illustration. This is a very, very early model of the Corsair. But click on that link and you too can show your patriotism by having your Corsair sign in your office. So I'm going to put that down. So let's talk a little bit about, we talked about the Devastator. Let's talk a little bit as we work our way out here, the American aerial torpedoes. Completely different story. Americans had incredible trouble with torpedoes. They dropped the torpedo, and as the torpedo goes down and then it sounds, it wouldn't come back up. It would hit the ship and not detonate. They not only had trouble with air-launched torpedoes, but the destroyer or ship-launched naval torpedoes, you've seen them on those tubes on the side of the ships, or on destroyers. They had problems with those. They also had trouble with submarines. So the American torpedo really, and I want to say, and you torpedo purists can argue with me in the comments section, the American aerial torpedoes were never really sorted out all the way to the end of the war. They did work towards the end of the war, were much better, but the Americans had trouble with their torpedoes, period, throughout the entire World War II. Now, the thing that has really changed in torpedo land is torpedoes, homing torpedoes, which the Germans, the Americans, all they were acoustic torpedoes. They would home in on the screws, the ships, and then submarines went to wire-guided torpedoes. A lot of munitions now are smart munitions, so they're wire-guided. So the days of having to basically get down low and track that target and fly a straight course are long gone. And so we don't expose the crews to the risks that they did in early in World War II and throughout World War II for our air crews. But so torpedoes are still around, but the torpedo bomber has gone by the wayside. Now, the other change in torpedoes is nuclear tips, which a lot of torpedoes can be nuclear tipped, and that's when they're going after, let's say, a capital ship like an aircraft carrier or a large cruiser. And that kind of, Greg, that changes to almost only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades. Probably in nuclear tipped torpedoes would be one of those as well. In other words, if you can get close, but you don't literally have to hit the ship like you would with a munition. Now, with a conventional munition. Now, the one thing that's interesting about, I'm going to throw out a Fred fun fact, and Greg can throw it up. There was evidence of when they pulled up the battleships at Pearl Harbor, and this is one of those things you can go out and look at. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but there is good evidence, and it's a historian here and that does a lot of work for us and presentations for us. You can go out and see some of his presentations, that there was a Japanese mini-sub that made it in to Pearl Harbor because some of the blast damage on, I believe it was the Oklahoma, indicates that a Japanese fleet torpedo was used from the explosion and the damage to the armor belt, and the aerial torpedoes had a lighter warhead. So a Fred fun fact there, you can go out, Greg can throw up some links to some stuff there in the video. It's not totally related to the Nakajima, but it is an interesting thing if they actually managed to get one of those mini subs, which were famously at Pearl Harbor. One of them actually managed to get inside the torpedo net and fire a torpedo at one of those battleships. So what is the legacy of these aircraft? This is another one of those technologies that is essentially a dead-end technology. Once the guidance systems in the torpedoes, as I mentioned, had improved, there was no reason to get these air crews in the high-risk areas that they were when they were trying to launch them, and that kind of went by the wayside. And it's a technology today that just simply doesn't exist. It is very sad that there are none of these aircraft represented in any great numbers in museums. It's very sad, but we've talked about Axis aircraft before. In many cases, there was no historical preservation considered for any of these planes. So if you enjoyed this episode today, go out and send it to a friend. And if you stumbled across us and you like what we presented, why don't you subscribe? Give us a subscription, like us on YouTube, like us on Facebook. Remember, we can't do any of this, and I'm in this Pacific hangar with probably about 30 aircraft and exhibits. We can't do any of this without your donation. So if you'll click on that donation link and give us a few shekels, we would appreciate it. My name is Fred Bell. I am the Vice Chairman of the Palm Springs Air Museum. Have a great day.